Good. I think we should start now. Welcome back to the seminar series, Receptions and Comparatisms. My name's David Ricks, and it's a great pleasure to introduce two speakers that I've heard in the flesh and who will, I'm sure, be just as vivid in the Zoom medium today. I trust we won't be accused of coming up with topics that lack intellectual breadth. Last week, we, so to speak, set the exam question, what is a language, to Lucy Jackson and Matthew Reynolds. And they sent us away with some very subtle answers and some tough new questions of their own. And I'm confident that's going to be the case today with the evidently related topic, orality and script worlds. The relationship between the oral and the written is, like the question, what is a language, one we're not going to resolve today, but it's clearly of pressing importance to students of classical reception and comparative literary studies alike. Just one obvious example would be those who've worked on the Homeric poems from Milman Parry and Albert B. Lord through John Miles Foley to Richard P. Martin today, scholars who've called in aid comparative approaches, and especially comparative oral epic, going beyond the West. Tonight's speakers, in rather different vein, I imagine, promise to offer us very interesting insights with truly global reach and attention to those topics of disciplinarity and temporalities, as well as translation, that we have discussed in previous weeks. They both come to us with Yale PhDs and both from the University of Chicago, where osmosis between classics and comparative literature is a long tradition. I should add, for the avoidance of misunderstanding, that Professor Rankin's recent appointment to the University of Chicago post-dated his invitation to the seminar, in which we'd carefully attempted to have people from different campuses in each week, but it's a happy outcome for him and of course for them. So, well, it's said that at a reception for Isaiah Berlin, his Who's Who entry was recited to cello accompaniment by Rostropovich and took up much of the evening. And I don't want to do that by retailing too many of the publications and accomplishments of tonight's speakers, but I'll just mention a couple of key things germane to tonight's event. In this setting, everyone's going to know Patrice Rankin as one of our own. He's on the International Advisory Board of the APGRD. And also, of course, he's one of the team of editors for the 2015 volume, The Oxford Handbook of Classical Drama in the Americas. But we're really talking about a professor of classics here with a very broad purview, which, among other things, embraces the difficult question of what sort of afterlife the Greco-Roman classics have when they're lived by writers of the African diaspora, not just in the United States, but also in Latin America, and that's crucial. He's written about important figures like Ralph Ellison, important and difficult topics like drama and civil disobedience, with books in each case. And at the moment, he's working on two larger projects of a history from below stripe, which have involved a lot of very interesting research in Brazil. And one dimension of all of that is going to come out in a project for Harvard University Press, a study with the title, very suggestive for tonight's talk, I think, Slavery and the Book. Meanwhile, Horn Saucy is university professor in comparative literature, East Asian languages and civilizations, and in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He's one of a line of eminent comparatists, notably sinologists, I think, who have the Greco-Roman form of classical training behind them, or should we say still with them. He too is very interested in translation, practice and theory, and his OUP book, Translation as Citation, in 2017, won the Veleck Prize. He's also been concerned with some of the bigger problems, intellectual problems that are at stake when we're comparing. See his 2019 study, Are We Comparing Yet? And earlier on his comparative literature in an age of globalization. And perhaps particularly relevant to tonight's talk is his volume, The Chinese Written Character as a Medium of Poetry, in 2008, where he represented key texts by Ernest Fenollosa, Ezra Pound, and others. So we've got a rich meal in store. I'll just remind you of the table manners. Each speaker will speak for 15 or 20 minutes in immediate succession without any more patter from me. And that main part of the session is recorded and will be posted on YouTube fairly promptly. And during that part, you, the audience, will be muted. We'll then take a 10-minute break, in which time the audience can feed the cat or boil the kettle, but also, if you find time, pose questions to our speakers in the chat function, with a slight preference perhaps for questions, at least in the first round, that are addressed to both speakers, but don't repress any pressing questions you have that you'd really like to ask concisely in the chat. And then after 10 minutes, we'll reconvene in unrecorded question and answer session. The conveners will have sifted through a few questions in an effort to prioritize. We'll then wind up that question and answer session by 6:30 UK time, especially if you'll reset your clocks properly. So our speakers are kindly speaking from a great distance. We don't want to tire them out too much. So with eager anticipation, and he's got a handout that's just about to appear in the chat, over to you, Patrice Rankin.
Terrific. Thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I have to say that while David was speaking, my internet went out. So it's going to be, it looks like it's a little glitchy. So I'm going to look and make sure that faces aren't frozen. And please don't hesitate, David or Justine or Fiona, to just step in if you see that I'm frozen and say something. Don't feel like you're interrupting me. I'm going to share a screen, but I'm not going to do it for too long because I want to make sure that we sort of see each other. But here, I want to start with a brief video of Kanye West's Donda, his song 24 from the CD, the new album Donda. Or not. Let me try that again. Not sure what's happening. Try one more time. If not, we'll move on without it.
He's done miracles on me. He's done miracles on me.
Okay, so in thinking about the question of orality and script worlds and the vast literature on the topic, I was drawn to a number of sideways and backdoor considerations inspired by Han's masterful studies of the question. Perhaps it was a coincidence that Kanye West released his album Donda during the same period of my reflections this past summer. But I was struck by the album's relevance to the topic and how it brings us a few questions in ways we might not have considered before. The more time passed, the more vindicated I felt in this approach, and maybe I'm still trying to convince myself. In his book, Hearing Homer's Song, The Brief Life and Big Idea of Milman Parry, Robert Kanigel observes that Parry's big idea of the Homeric poetry as an oral formulaic poetry came to encompass a wide range of cultures and instantiations of oral composition. The oral formulaic theory hypothesizes, of course, that Homer, if he existed, was one in a line of traditional poets whose practices of oral composition were alive and well among the Guslar, singers of tales in the former Yugoslavia. After Parry's premature death, Albert Lord applied the theory to Old English, and its implications reached as far as to the 20th century gospel preachers in the United States. In the context of our comparatisms conversations, which have encompassed, of course, as we've heard, disciplinarity, temporalities, language, and translation, I am interested today in the sonic, visual, and technological aspects of the oral formulaic idea and classical reception. Many will know that today is not the first time someone will have drawn an analogy between rap music and oral literature. And there are several examples I could have included in the bibliography. I've only included one or two. John Paul Hampstead's work on Virgilian, Homeric, and Anglo-Saxon comparisons to the themes of rap. He includes such themes as feasting, raiding, the search for treasure, misogyny, unfortunately, and fatalism. They all flow in hip hop. As they do in Homer, these themes encompass the wide range of human emotions. At Jay-Z's induction to the Songwriters Hall of Fame, U2's Bono said that Jay-Z's lyrics and music touch every emotion. He says rage, love, sadness, joy, and tragedy. Writing in 2010, Daniel Blanks links rap and hip hop theater to what he calls the African diasporic performance aesthetic of orator, which includes, he says, storytelling, proverbs, riddles, chants, call and response, songs, gesture mime, as well as other presentational techniques. For the embodiment of orator in the 21st century, we might recall Jay-Z's legendary and prodigious compositional style. As Scarface said of him at the induction, he writes those songs in his head. He doesn't have a rap folder like everyone else does. His rap folder is in his head. And we could spend time with the many features of oral literature and look at comparisons between Homer, hip hop, rap music, etc. I've just given you a couple on the handout that pertain to enjambment. Homer won Andra Moyenepe Musa Po Lutra Pon Hos Mala Plankte. And if you compare that to Jay-Z's lyrics, you can see the flow, cursing the very God that brought this grief to be. My life is based on sacrifices, jewels like Isis, this kind of flowing into the next line as an example. And you can compare that to Jesus Walks of Kanye West, which is very clearly a written rap. As it pertains to Kanye himself, he was one of the focal points of Danelle Padilla Peralta's 2015 piece in Eidolon, looking at the theme of Damocles, and his references to classical themes, his quotes, his visual gestures toward the classics are many. I just want to, and again, I'm going to go back and forth the slides because I don't want to hide my face. But these quotes from first a song, West's Wolves, don't fly too high, your wings might melt. You're much too good to be true. I'm just bad for you. And that's, of course, Icarus. And then in an interview from 2019, he says, Rome is the Silicon Valley of humanity, which is just an interesting quote. We could keep going with this, but with this, as it pertains to the Icarus reference, I find it very interesting. If we consider the images from the song I just shared, from the song 24 from this album, Donda, and I'll bring the image up one more time so that you can see. Floating more like flying, the artist reaches planetary heights high enough to reunite with his mother, who died 14 years earlier from complications during surgery. For the man in the sky, there is no countervailing gravitational pull. For a time, Icarus cannot fall. In this moment, suspended in time, his failures are far away. In this moment, his mother, Donda, has not died. Far away is the collapse of this man's marriage to the mother of his children, Kim Kardashian. Far away is his bizarre behavior, whether the televised tantrum alongside President Donald Trump or his impulsive, erratic, and uncoordinated campaign for the presidency of the United States. Even the negative critical reception of Donda received extremely negative critical reception, but even that can't touch him at these celestial heights. There's only the potential for flight. And in another song from this album, you can see here the visual indexing of the three graces from Caesar's palace in Las Vegas, both The Weeknd and Little Baby in those songs. So Parry and Lord showed how in the hands of a skilled poet, a simple storyline could go from a sentence to an elaborate orally composed poem lasting several hours or even days. How little of a word, sound sample, or image is necessary to evoke an entire epic, to trigger individual and collective memories? Can a gesture or an image be a poem? What is the role of visual vocabulary in oral literature? If opsis is operative, does the thing then become theater? Does the phenomenon then become theater? Fiona and Justine have written an excellent book on epic theater on the contemporary stage and the role of narrative and technology in contemporary storytelling that is relevant here. So as you can see, again, a number of questions that Donda raises. This is the first group I would ask as they pertain to orality, literature, and the visual gesturing. Is this epic? Is this oral literature? What do we do with visual gestures? What do we do with these brief snapshots, let's say in a video of the three graces or any other types of indices? So that's the first group of questions. Another group of questions that I thought were interesting as we look at Donda and as we think about Kanye West are questions around technology. Another aspect of Ye, as he wants to now be called, of his contributions to our conversations today. Now, technology has always accompanied what we define as oral literature. And here again, we have the expert on the line. I commend you to Han's work, his 2016 book, Technology from Start to Finish. When we think about the innovations of the idea of oral literature, technology has always been there. In his article, Banks, I referred to Daniel Banks earlier, he's astute in his recognition that the role of technology, astute in his recognition of the role of technology in the documentation of orality, the two turntables connected to the toggle switch that allowed Parry to record evidence of traditions he tied to Homer and to heroic narratives. In the Bronx, New York, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, these turntables accompany what Banks calls a reversal of the process, as rap artists transform the soundscape, heightening their oral narratives through sampling, remixing, and imposing new forms onto old material. Donda problematizes ideas of narrative and artistic closure through its sounds, images, and its technology. Shortly after its initial appearance, Ye began updating recorded songs, claiming that Universal had released the album prematurely. Versions of 4 songs appear as part 2. Ye is building a paid streaming service called the Donda Stem Player, where subscribers can customize any song or isolate stems, as he calls it, to separate any vocals, bass, samples, and drums. This is the first product of Yeezy Tech, which Ye intends to rival Apple, inspired by its founder, Steve Jobs. Now, the voice of Donda West, who was professor and chair of English at English Communication, Media and Theater Department at Chicago State University, is sampled on several of the album's tracks. That is She is alive through technology. In addition, it is sometimes hard to ascertain if her voice was recorded before her death or a product of artificial intelligence, which raises the foundational Homeric question of authorship and authenticity. It also raises ethical questions. There's an article about the deepfake voice in a recent documentary about Anthony Bourdain, where his voice was manufactured. And now this claimed to be a documentary, which we take as a genre of truth-telling, and yet this account was, as Heather Rosner in the New Yorker article argued, problematic from an ethical standpoint. Let me, Donda opens with the song, with a singer, Selena Johnson, chanting the name Donda 58 times, which is the age of Donda West when she died. This is an invocation to the artist's muse. Let me just, again, this won't be a long sample, but I think it's really worth hearing a little bit of it.
Donda, 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 Donda. Donda, 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 donda.
So I won't play all 58, but I thought it would be interesting to hear that. Critics argue that the album lacks a sense of composition or completeness. That is, that it fails at closure. And yet this hauntology makes one wonder if failure isn't the point. Closure is a kind of death. The completion of a composition is a kind of ending. Ye reanimates the dead continuously, danda, 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 or at least he turns Homeric katabasis to an anabasis. And then the third broad consideration that I believe is important for us in having a dialogue with Donda, with Kanye, Ye, is race. Now, the construction of oral literature has always been a racial phenomenon, or if we prefer, a temporally constructed contrast between ancient and modern, primitive and civilized, underdeveloped and developed, orality and literacy, or Europe in contrast to others. More generously, in the estimation of writers like Josephus and Marcel Josse, oral tradition was superior to literacy, orality as the return to and restoration of a more essential gestural mode of being in the world. And here again, I commend you to Han's work. As it pertains to race, anthropology is as pertinent to our conversation as is comparative literature. Beginning with Franz Boas, anthropology was directly in conversation with the racial theories of the early 20th century, such as the eugenics of Madison Grant and Lorthrop Stoddard, cited in Isabel Wilkerson's Caste as American precursors to Nazism. Parry took classes with Boas's student, Alfred Kroeber, at the University of California, Berkeley. And some of these references, of course, are on the handout. I've given you that. But recently in January, some students initiated the change of what is Kroeber Hall at the University of California, Berkeley, calling Kroeber, quote, a powerful symbol that continues to evoke exclusion and erasure for Native Americans, unquote. So anthropology influences Parry, and anthropologists in turn embrace the evidence of oral literature that Parry began to gather in the late 20s and then into the 30s. Ruth Finnegan, as an example, you could use any number of examples, and these are in your bibliography, but Ruth Finnegan, who is known as an anthropologist of oral traditions in West African countries, she cites Lord. Lord's 1960 work, not Maus, not Josse, she cites Lord. And then in turn, in a more recent work, 2016, I believe it was, Laila Abu Lughod, who is interested in Bedouin women's oral poetry, cites Finnegan. So here again, anthropologists embracing this idea of oral literature. Rap maps onto the racial landscape that I'm laying out here, ubiquitously likened to the creative work of West African griot. This black noise that is rap, as Trisha Rose named it, this encounter between Western civilization and blackened bodies to borrow a term from Zakiya Iman Jackson's book, Becoming Human, is part of a racialized discourse that classicists have not fully come to terms with. Technology is part of the racial construct as well. From the daguerreotypes of Joseph T. Zealy to the proliferation of the moving image on cellular phones, the Black body became an object reified as something other than human. The ubiquity of another technological tool, namely the camera as a means of surveillance, might signal a shift to a kind of accountability, testimony to the humanity of the formerly blackened phenomenon. However, Jared Sexton's study of Black masculinity and the media sobers us, calling our attention to the reality that if each iteration of violence against Black Americans has the potential of humanization, playback of the killing of Rodney King, Michael Brown, George Floyd, and others also reinforce an order of things, what Sexton calls the maintenance of an anti-Black social order. Think about this. Ye, stepping into this technological framework, wants to usurp this order of things, using concepts like artist, founder, creator, innovator to describe himself. Again, we might reject what he's presenting, but it's worth noting. It's a moment worth noting. There's also an argument here as well for popular culture, and I'm wrapping up, but for popular culture as a place where classicists, comparatists, and ethnomusicologists, anthropologists, and professionals in Black studies might make sense of the oral formulaic theory alongside sound, image, technology, and the relationship of these to race and its construction, as Peter McMurray does in his article on sound spaces in the 1991 Rodney King video. He argues very convincingly that the news media's speaking over the video blocks some of the content in a way that obscures what was actually happening at the time. And he peels back that news media to hear the video as it stood. These are all in your handout. Let me just close with a couple of images. Again, I'm maybe still trying to convince myself to take Ye seriously, but he speaks a little bit about his artistic influences. And James Turrell is one. He says in a 2016 interview, "I have a condition called synesthesia. Everything I write sonically is a painting. So what do we do with literature, writing, and orality when everything I write is a painting? What is the relationship between the visual and sound?" And then he also cites Takashi Murakami as an influence as well, a contemporary Japanese artist. Just two quick images here, and I'll turn it over to Han.
All right. Beautiful. Thank you, Patrice. I'm going to pick up from one of the themes, at least. In fact, I'll probably connect with most of the themes of Patrice's presentation in mind. I have a little list of things that I want to do in relation to the term orality. And I think the main agenda item is to undercut an inveterate habit of considering orality in terms of a linear, evolutionary, and hierarchical model of human culture. You know, typically, the word orality is thought of as a stage of culture that everybody's culture supposedly has been through. If you look at old compilations like The Growth of Literature by Munro and Nora Chadwick from the 1930s, it is an enormous 3-volume compilation, and it ranges around the world, talking about the oral literature of people A, people B, people C, going around. The notion being that orality is what is common to all human groups, but that some groups have left it behind, have adopted literacy and even printing, right? So there's a kind of a tacit media theory that's also a kind of anthropology in which orality is defined by what it lacks, right? Orality is a state of not yet being literate. That often happens. The primitive connotation of orality can sometimes be valorized, right, as being the essential and living thing, or it can be put down as something that's not yet evolved, something that's not yet developed. I think we just want to get out of that set of habits entirely. I take my cue from people like Johannes Fabian, who back in the 1970s, when I had much more hair on my head, was writing about how all people are contemporary, and that should be the primary fact that any anthropology considers, right? His book is called Time and the Other, subtitled How Anthropology Makes Its Object. And I think I owe it to Johannes Fabian the idea that time is an absolutely controversial category when we're thinking about human others. And one finds this linear sense of orality as a stage in culture in people like Finnegan, who's just been mentioned, in Marshall McLuhan, right, in Walter Ong. And you couldn't accuse Walter Ong of not being a champion of oral literature and of memory and recitation, but it always comes tinged with this kind of temporal model, which I'm not very happy with. So I want to put it aside. And that, in fact, was one of the reasons for writing the book that Patrice has so kindly referred to, The Ethnography of Rhythm, which is subtitled Orality and Its Technologies. Again, I muddled for a while in my mind, should I call it orality and technology or orality facing technology? And in one of those 3 a.m. realizations of the obvious, I thought, well, of course, it's not and technology. Orality is always a technology in its own right, and it's being produced in tandem with other technologies. So anyway, I don't really want to recite over that whole book. It was a lot of fun to write. I carried it with me for a long time. I think it's probably generally true that when you write a book, even a dull scholarly book, it's a piece of your intellectual autobiography. And maybe I will take a moment and revisit how this subject came to be, how I got interested in the question of oral composition. It was long ago when I was a college freshman taking Greek. I had an extremely gifted teacher, Peter Burian, who mentioned to us Milman Parry going up and down the hills of Yugoslavia, recording songs and analyzing them for the formulae, and how that explained the fact that Homer is always repeating the same phrases. And so this excited me very much. There must have been some kind of seed of an anthropologist in me. So I ran off and got Wace and Stubbings, the companion to Homer, which probably all of us have on our shelf, where I learned also about Ventris and Chadwick, right, and the decipherment of Linear B. The Making of Homeric Verse, edited by Adam Perry, had just recently come out, right? We're talking about the late 70s here. And somehow in my mind, Perry and Ventris and Chadwick were associated as, and this is actually the way that Adam Perry presents things, that Milman Parry was simply the person who looked at the formula for long enough and tabulated them carefully enough to realize that Homeric composition had to derive from a kind of a systematic organization of phrases that could be useful only in the context of oral composition, right? Much as Ventris and Chadwick stopped looking for correlations with other languages, stopped looking even at the characters of Linear B, but began treating them as algebraic units and asking how do they permute with other units, right? So in both cases, you had something presented as a kind of a purely formal deductive process, which was not actually true about Milman Parry. I won't say anything about Ventris and Chadwick, but about Parry, it was certainly not true. There were a lot of people who were active in the background of Parry. It's good to be reminded of Alfred Kroeber's very ambiguous legacy there. There's another maybe less terrifying ambiguous legacy in the reason for Parry to go to Paris in the first place in 1923. He was a recently graduated Berkeley BA. He wanted to go and study with Victor Bérard. And Victor Bérard was one of these 19th century characters who had worked in diplomacy and journalism. He had a big yacht and he liked to sail around the Mediterranean, scoping out places that might have been the sites mentioned in the Odyssey. And in his off hours, he translated the Odyssey into French. And so something about this appealed to Milman Parry. He wrote Bérard and said, I would like to be your student. And Bérard never answered him, or maybe gave him a cold shoulder. But anyway, there was no master-student relationship there. And if there had been, it wouldn't have been a smooth one. One of Bérard's publications, produced during the First World War, is called Friedrich August Wolff, Un mensonge de la science allemande, where he takes to task Friedrich August Wolff, well known for his Prolegomena ad Homerum, where he puts forth the hypothesis that the Homeric poems were oral compositions. Bérard has two charges against this. One is that Wolff has no appreciation of the artistic sublimity of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He debases them by making them oral compositions. The other is that French people had already come up with this theory before. And he cites Hédelin and other 17th century scholars. So if Milman Parry had appeared on Bérard's doorstep and unrolled the proof that Homer was all formulae, Bérard would not have been happy about it at all. Why do I go into this? Well, the oral genre sort of inclines us to telling stories. So here I'm telling a few stories, but they're meant to be meaningful stories. There was a debate about orality and literacy going back to the 17th century, mostly on French territory, because France is the country where literacy commanded the most honor and power. It was very much a part of the state building projects of successive French sovereigns to found things like the French Academy and to patronize writers who were reviving a certain version of classical antiquity, right? All this is well known. In the course of this reform of the French language and attempt to remodel European culture on an imaginary classical model, there was also the counter discourse, right? This is what's known as the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. And the role of Homer in this quarrel is well known to be central. But what's the valorization given to orality in this? When people like Aubignac, that's François Hédelin, Abbé d'Aubignac, when he writes his Conjectures académiques in the 1660s, a work that could not be published at the time, it was deemed a bit scandalous, but it circulated in manuscript. He says, Homer, we don't have to admire Homer. There's nothing really good about Homer. He is no different from those guys who sing ballads on the Pont Neuf. And maybe one day he got a little ambitious and sang a really long ballad, but that's about all it is. We, in the modern era, we can plan our work better. We have more sources to call on. We can produce genuine literature, but that Homer guy, forget about it. So the orality problem and the Homeric problem come up into French culture at this moment, with orality coded as the thing you don't want to be or do, right? The thing that that rational, literate people want to turn away from, right? The thing that is disprized. This was very curious for me to read in the 1970s because I'd been sitting in on the classes of Monsieur Derrida and reading his Grammatology, which constructs a very plausible story about how orality is always seen as superior to literacy. Orality is seen in a particular way. And he traces, you remember, that line from Plato to Rousseau, in which the oral is, it's the voice that expresses the soul, it's the intimate, it's the true, it's the unquestionable, and writing is the external, the thing that can be cast off, the thing that should be cast off, the merely mechanical and technological, right? Well, I think we need to put all of this into a sense of, into a kind of dialogue. It is true that literacy possessed outward, obvious political and social power that orality did not have, at least in the world of 1660. And characters like Rousseau, and I would say even in his day, Plato, by advocating for orality against literacy, were doing a countercultural thing. I mean, Rousseau obviously was doing a countercultural thing. Nothing came more naturally to him than that. So Rousseau standing up for Homer as a poet who was exemplary because he didn't write, and Vico then taking this in another direction, making Homer a collective voice of the people and a sort of a fiction, a semi-deified version of the population, were paving the way for people like Herder and later Wolff, who were advocates of what we'd call today minority cultures or emergent cultures in the Europe of their time. Right? So, in fact, this is a very contemporary sort of battle in which there are people who have all the authority, and then there are others who are trying to claim authority for something that hasn't got any of it yet. And they're calling on extreme forms of argument in order to make their countercultural case plausible. So that's part of what orality was doing. Another thing that orality was doing, starting with Spinoza and Richard Simon and going through people like Lessing and other scriptural studies people, was to desacralize the sacred texts, to argue that these texts were put together by somebody using pre-existing materials, but they might have been put together in a different way. And if we think of them as being patchwork compositions, we begin to see the seams and the places where something has been added or subtracted or changed. Obviously, the ecclesiastical establishments were not very happy about this, and Simon and Spinoza and Lessing all had to suffer the consequences of their outspokenness or be very, very discreet. So, all right, we're heading on into now the 19th century with all this stuff going on in the background. The great innovation then is machinery that captures human bodies in action. And part of this was led to a branch of a version of linguistics that we no longer really recognize because the machines are obsolete, I suppose. Let me see if I can do a little screen sharing here. Here, I'm going to jump down to a picture of one of these machines. This looks like a recording machine, but it isn't. Or rather, it doesn't record sound, it records vibrations. And there was no intent to play back the vibrations. What was important was to demonstrate how speech is made physically. Here's a little piece of documentation from one of these sessions. Somebody is saying, "Ma pauvre femme," right? My poor woman. And the lines here represent movements of the larynx and of the mouth. Why this was important to do was in order to legitimate the study of patois. In France, of course, there was a national language, a very, very national language, if I may say so, which had been suppressing the patois spoken in the villages through the agency of the national school system. And in the 19th century, many people went out with the aim of doing salvage anthropology in the villages. Pierre-Jean Rousselot, who's the author of this little sample that you see here, was from a peasant background, and he had an unusually sharp ear. He could detect differences in the vowels and consonants of people of different generations in the villages around his village. And so there was a spatial series of differences. If you lived farther away, you spoke more differently. And there was a temporal difference. Your grandparents talked one way and your children might talk a different way. And Rousselot was able to capture this. He had the indulgence of his bishop. He was a priest, but was allowed to become a professor at the Collège de France, that eminently secular institution. And what he was doing was really showing that the human body is an extraordinarily precise instrument for capturing and relaying certain kinds of information. In this case, it was vowels and consonants in dialect. Other people at the time were capturing bodies. Here are some composite stills from Marais examining how it is that people walk and run and jump. All these people were connected through a common set of institutions active in French intellectual life in the 1880s. And one result was to draw attention to folk traditions, not as relics of some othered kind of humanity, but as exemplary of what everybody is and does, although perhaps more so, you might say. Another figure in this tradition, Jean Paulhan, was he was a young man with no prospects, so he took a job where he could in Madagascar. So we're getting back close to Africa, if not exactly in Africa. The French, as you know, had recently asserted domination over Africa, and one of the first things over Madagascar, and one of the first things they did was build a lycée. So off goes Jean Paulhan to be a professor in the lycée of Tanarive. He went looking for folk songs in the hills on the weekend, and he learned Malgache quite fluently, began writing down these folk songs, but after the third or fourth weekend, he felt disappointed because people were using the same lines all the time. Right? He had been brought up to think that the important thing about poetry was originality, and that if you were just using cliches, that was, aesthetically and morally not a good thing. But the important part is, rather than abandoning the project, he chose to listen more carefully, because he noticed that, yes, the same lines kept recurring, but they would recur in situations where their meaning was different, owing to the lines before and after them. He wrote then a little book about this poetry of what he called proverbs, right? La poésie du proverbe, in Madagascar, where the attention is not on the words that people use, but on the speech act of deploying a certain proverb in a certain place. That's what gives it its meaning. And once he had figured out this secret, that the words were not important, the epithets were the units that were to be used, his original project collapsed, but a new project grew up of understanding human language as being basically proverbial in structure. In fact, I would not put Paulhan's collection of folk songs very far away from Yeazy's stem player concept, right? Because what Paulhan had discovered was that it's the free combination of inherited units that enables you to be an artist in this kind of traditional society. So I define orality for Paulhan by modularity, combination, and virtuality. When you begin a stanza, there are X many possible ways that it can go. And when you finish your stanza of lines, of course, that were all totally unoriginal, you've made an original composition, but it is one of 10 billion compositions. If I can allude to the poetry book of Raymond Queneau, right? 100 billion poems. That's the dimension of virtuality in which any composition exists in an oral society. So this, as you can see, doesn't have very much to do with the mouth versus the hand. It's an originally generated aesthetic that is specific to this medium. It could be discovered perhaps only because Jean Paulhan was sitting down writing the stuff out by hand and lost patience at one point, right? So there was a foreign technology that was part of the process of revealing this indigenous technology, but the foreign technology was not essential to it. It was only a pathway to it. All right, so I see Paulhan as being one of the discoverers of orality for the early 20th century, and a certain passage from his book makes its way through about a dozen other texts that would all have been very important for after Perry's original publication of the epithets. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about Marcel Jousse. He like Rousselot, he was a peasant. His mother was a single parent, she was illiterate, living out in the countryside near Le Mans. And he was a bright boy. she sent him to the public school, which was not usually done in that very Catholic milieu. He survived the public school, went on to become a priest and to join the Jesuits, but he definitely had his own way of solving problems. The problem for religious people in France at that moment, around 1900, was modernisme. People had been reading German theologians who snipped the Bible up into little bits and showed that the pieces didn't belong together. And their answer to this was simply incoherence, right? It doesn't work. And because it doesn't work, we don't need to make our faith and morals hinge on the way this text is written. Jus was determined to show that this was not the case. And he had an elaborate workaround in which the written texts were all invalid. There wasn't a good or a bad written text of the Gospels. Rather, they were all very poor transcriptions of an originally sung and danced version of the Gospels. And he backs this argument up with huge ethnographic documentation going around the world, inventorying the way other groups use chunks of memorized language combined in new ways. And Paulhan is one of the people he cites with most gusto. What I love about Jus is his bloody-mindedness, as you folks in England would call it, his willingness to plunge right ahead with his ideas. And he says at one point, I think, that Jesus is the Homer of Torah. So, you know, if you liked one of those flavors, you'll like the other one too. The idea being that the Gospels are replayings, are not a completely new production, but are replayings of topoi that are inherited from a previous discourse. So in that, as elsewhere, we get modularity, we get the disappearance of the individual author in favor of a collective whose voice the individual author transmits, iteration or iterability, as Mr. Derrida would have called it, interactivity with an audience, right? Because no oral performer is going to be able to bore the audience for long. They'll just get up and walk away. And that dimension of virtuality in which the realization of one version of a work is never conclusive. There are an infinity of other realizations before and after it. I think these are all extremely potent dimensions along which to think of works of art. And I like applying them to our more conventional, ordinary works of art, even those things that are printed on dead trees that we call books. If we begin to view them in the manner of this orality, they take on quite different appearances. So I just want to conclude, there are reasons to be interested in orality. The group of reasons that we find in McLuhan, Finnegan, Ong, etc., I think those are not the good reasons. I think there are these other reasons that have to do with an open aesthetic, right? L'opera aperta, as Umberto Eco called it in the 1960s, responding to currents of art and literature in his time. Those, I think, are the things that make orality valuable. And like the earlier ones, they do open our eyes onto a wider prospect of human activity. Perhaps they'll help us do it better and less damagingly. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to both of our speakers. I promised range, and we've gone all the way from Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas to Madagascar. I promised temporalities, and we've gone all the way from gospel pericope all the way up to the somewhat controversial and multi-named figure of Kanye West, as he was once known. So, time pressing as it is, we'll break for 5 minutes, which means feeding the cat more expeditiously or boiling your kettle likewise. And we'll reconvene in 5 minutes when my colleague Justine McConnell will take the helm with questions. I'm sure they're going to be more questions than we can handle, but that shouldn't inhibit you as an audience from feeding them into the chat in a concise form. And from me, many thanks to both of our speakers for oral performance of high quality, apart from anything else. So thank you very much, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes' time. Thank you.
Thank you, David.